Welcome, friend. I'm Jack, host of the channel, and today we're diving into another episode. Pour yourself a drink and get comfortable, because I've got a powerful story coming your way. If something hits deep, drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's get into it.
Mark Stevens was a former NC wrestler and a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu purple belt, built like a tank. At age 9, he took down a 13-year-old boy who attempted to bully him. His parents, after numerous visits to therapists and psychiatrists, discovered that Mark had a hormonal imbalance, granting him hysterical strength. His body produced significant amounts of adrenaline, making him almost superhuman for short bursts. To manage this, he was given medication and instructed to engage in physical training, avoiding any fight-or-flight situations. His parents ensured he stuck to this routine, and soon Mark was training with the school wrestling team and practicing BJJ. His mother also introduced meditation exercises to help him stay calm. The efforts paid off, and Mark became known as a calm individual. However, those close to him often referred to him as the Hulk. His coaches knew that once the Hulk was unleashed, there was no stopping him. Mark's college life went smoothly, securing a decent job, and things seemed to be on the upswing. He later married Lisa. Mark Stevens was heading home to Salt Lake City after wrapping up a successful negotiation that would significantly improve cash flow for the software company he worked at. He also caught up with his younger sister Sophia, who came up from Provo, where she attended Brigham Young University. They had dinner at the DoubleTree by Hilton and spent hours catching up. It had been years since they last saw each other, and Mark cherished the time spent together. Now he was eagerly looking forward to seeing Lisa, his wife of nearly 4 years. Although he hated being away from her, it was necessary for his job. What excited him most was their 4-year wedding anniversary, which was just 2 days away. Lisa was unaware that Mark had already made a reservation at a local resort hotel for the weekend and had ordered a teardrop sapphire necklace to give her at the hotel. He planned to pick it up from the jeweler the following afternoon. However, he began to wonder where Lisa might be as he tried calling her before boarding his flight. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The same thing happened when he called their home. Perhaps she was out shopping with a friend, he thought. Reflecting on how much he missed Lisa, standing just under 5 feet 5 inches, with long wavy blonde hair, green eyes, and a light complexion that always seemed to have a perpetual tan, he sighed. The only issue he had with her was her extreme jealousy. Normally one of the sweetest women he knew, Lisa's unfounded accusations frustrated him. Mark loved her deeply and would never cheat on her. He went out of his way to reassure her of his fidelity. Still, it had gotten to the point where he couldn't even attend a business meeting with a female colleague without Lisa suspecting an affair. He believed he had resolved the issue by challenging her to hire a private investigator to follow him. He hoped that once she had proof of his fidelity, she would relax and realize her fears were baseless. Mark was growing increasingly frustrated with her jealousy and false accusations. It wasn't that he had no secrets from her, he did, but her constant nagging about supposed infidelity threatened to expose one of those secrets in an ugly way. As he thought about her incessant suspicions, his heart rate increased. He took several deep breaths, but to no avail. Feeling his face start to burn, he knew he had to regain control quickly. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small packet of pills, took one, and began to relax as his heart rate gradually returned to normal. The man sitting next to him noticed his discomfort. "Are you all right, sir?" the man asked. "Do you need me to call someone?" Mark shook his head. "No, but thank you for asking. It's just an old heart condition. I have medication for it." The man nodded and sat back, though he continued to keep an eye on Mark just in case. Finally, the plane landed. Mark grabbed his luggage and headed to his car in the short-term parking lot. He tried calling Lisa again, but her voicemail answered. The same thing happened when he called the house. Where could she be, he wondered, starting the car and driving home. When he finally pulled into the garage, he noticed Lisa's car was gone. Odd, he thought, as she was usually home from work by 6 p.m. It was now around 7 p.m. Maybe she had decided to go out for a drink with some colleagues, though it was rare. He never begrudged her time to unwind, but she usually called or texted to let him know. Moreover, She knew he was coming home today, and she would typically be there to reconnect when he returned from a trip. He grabbed his things and walked into the dark house. After putting his things away, he headed downstairs to see if Lisa had left a note. Finding nothing, he made himself a cup of coffee. This was strange, he thought. She always let him know when she would be out, so why was there no note? He pondered this as he sipped his coffee. Suddenly his phone rang. Seeing that it was Lisa, he answered. "Lisa?" he asked. "Where are you?" "I'm sorry, Mark," she replied. "I was getting ready for tonight and didn't realize you had called until a few minutes ago." "What were you getting ready for?" Mark asked. "It's a little surprise. Some friends and I wanted to celebrate your return home. Why don't you come over so we can celebrate?" "Sure. Where are you?" She gave him an address, and he wrote it down. "Is this a club or a restaurant or something?" Mark asked. "An old friend of mine has a private club at his house, and we decided to put together something for you, kind of a combination welcome home and anniversary party." "That sounds like fun," Mark said. Lisa laughed. "Yes, I promise it'll be a lot of fun. Wear something casual, okay?" "Okay, I'll see you soon." "See you, babe," she said before ending the call. Strange, Mark thought. She didn't say she loved him, yet this was supposed to be a surprise anniversary celebration. Still, something about her tone made him wonder what was going on. He went upstairs, showered, shaved, and dressed in jeans and a polo shirt. He looked up the address on Google Maps and saw that it was in a rough part of town. Who does she know that lives out there? He wondered. He knew most of the people at her insurance office and didn't think any of them lived in that area. He recalled she once associated with a rough crowd when she was younger, but thought she had outgrown that phase. He locked up, got into his car, and entered the address into his GPS. He backed out and followed the GPS to the address, feeling a bit uneasy. When he reached the destination, he saw a medium-sized house sitting in the middle of a lot, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Pickups and motorcycles were parked around the place, and Mark started to get a bit concerned. He didn't recognize any of the vehicles. He pulled in, parked, and walked to the front door. A large man wearing a t-shirt and jeans opened the door when Mark knocked. Mark noticed the beer in his hand and heard loud music coming from inside. "Yeah," the man asked. "I'm Mark Stevens, and my wife Lisa asked me to meet her here. I hope I have the right address." The man smiled, but Mark wasn't convinced it was a smile born of genuine friendship. The man reached out and shook Mark's hand. "You must be Lisa's husband. I'm Jack. We've been expecting you. Come on in." Mark walked in and looked around to see several other large men in the front room. "Hey everyone, the man of the hour is finally here," Jack said. The other men nodded and smiled at Mark. They may have been smiling, but Mark didn't feel any real friendship in the room. "Where's Lisa?" Mark asked. "Oh, she's downstairs getting ready for the main event," Jack said, causing the others to chuckle. "Want a beer?" Yeah, sure," Mark replied. One of the others handed Mark a cold beer. "Thanks," Mark said as he opened it and took a tentative sip. "So, what is this main event?" he asked. Jack grinned. "That's the surprise. Your wife wanted to do something special for your anniversary and asked us to help her out." "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. Who are you guys?" "Well, that over there is Tommy," Jack said, pointing at one of the men in the room. "Over there is Jerry, and that guy next to him is Steve, and that big guy back there is Bull. Pretty sure you can guess why." Mark saw the large, muscular man standing by the kitchen table. All of them looked as tough as nails, and Mark noticed the large knife sheathed in a scabbard on Jerry's hip. "Yeah, and you're all Lisa's friends?" "Yep," Tommy replied. "Have been for a while, haven't seen her much since she married you, though." "She never mentioned any of you to me," Mark said. "I'm not surprised," Tommy replied. "Most people try to avoid us as much as they can." "And you have a private club here?" Mark asked. "Yeah," Jack said. "Down in the basement. Built it ourselves. We like to get together from time to time, have a few drinks, bring in some entertainment, you know." The others chuckled at that, but Mark's unease grew. Something felt off, and he couldn't shake the sense that something bad was about to happen. He didn't know what yet, but the tension in the room was thick. Just then, Mark heard footsteps coming up from the basement. "She's ready," a sixth man said as he entered the front room. "Is this her husband?" "Yeah," Jack replied. "Mark, this is Jake. He'll escort you downstairs." What's going to happen? Mark asked, his unease intensifying. A little surprise. I promise it'll be an evening you won't forget. The others chuckled, but Mark was nervous. It'll be all right. Come on, Lisa's waiting for you, Jake said. Mark walked over to Jake, who led him downstairs. Happy anniversary, Jack called after them as Mark began his descent. When Mark reached the basement, he saw a small bar in one corner and a well-lit, raised area that took up one end of the room. A curtain hung across the stage-like area, but what worried him most was the bed in the center of the stage and the camera mounted on a tripod a few feet back. Neon beer signs adorned the walls, and the room had a dark, club-like atmosphere. A pool table sat at the opposite end, and there were a few scattered tables and chairs. A jukebox against the wall was the source of the loud music playing in the background. 2 other men stood in the room, watching Mark as he entered. Jake led him to a chair positioned in front of the stage, next to a table. Have a seat, Jake said, pointing to the chair. Where's Lisa? Mark asked, his heart pounding. She'll be out shortly. Go on, sit down. You can put your beer on the table if you want. Mark set his beer down and looked around, something deep inside telling him he needed to leave immediately. But he suspected the 5 men upstairs wouldn't let him walk out so easily, and he was worried about Lisa. What would they do to her if he left? He took a final sip of his beer and placed the bottle on the table. The moment he sat down, Jake and the 2 other men grabbed his arms and quickly zip-tied them to the arms of the chair. What the hell is going on? Mark asked angrily. The men ignored him and zip-tied his ankles to the legs of the chair. Get me out of here right now, Mark demanded, growing more furious by the second. Shut up, jerk, came a familiar voice. Mark looked up to see Lisa standing on the stage, wearing nothing but a tiny thong and a half bra. What the hell is this? Mark demanded. Why are you dressed like that? Who are these guys? This is to celebrate our anniversary, she spat. These guys are my friends, and they're going to help me teach you a lesson about cheating. She threw a picture onto his lap. He looked at it and saw that it was a photo of him eating dinner with his sister. I've never cheated on you. You've got this all wrong, he screamed. Suddenly, Mark saw stars as one of the men punched him in the face. He shook his head and blinked, trying to clear his vision. Stop it, Lisa shouted. The man backed off. He'll be the one to teach himself a lesson. She turned back to her husband. Lisa, stop this right now and we can talk. It's not what it looks like, Mark pleaded. Oh, really? It looks to me like you're enjoying yourself with that blonde floozy. If you can enjoy yourself, so can I. But unlike you, I'm not going to keep it a secret. With that, she stepped back onto the stage. Okay, boys, it's showtime. Mark tried to object, but one of the men gagged him with a ball gag, silencing him. He fought back, but his efforts were in vain. By now, all the men had made their way downstairs. Jack stood next to Mark, whispering in his ear. Nothing personal, but Lisa's an old friend, so we're helping her out. Sit tight and enjoy the show. Once she's done, we'll let you go. Maybe she'll go home with you, but that's up to her. Mark tried to say something, but the gag muffled his words. Just relax. Take your medicine like a man, Jack said, patting Mark on the shoulder before stepping back. Mark's heart pounded as he watched Lisa on stage. He tried to control his breathing, to calm the storm of rage building inside him, but it wasn't working this time. The adrenaline that his body was famous for was rising fast. As the music played, Lisa started dancing, twirling around like a stripper. She kicked off her shoes, slowly removing her remaining clothes. You like this, lover boy? She sneered at Mark. Did your little blonde do this for you, huh? Mark's heart raced, but he was trapped. Lisa danced more, laughing as she tossed her tiny thong at Mark. I hope you like this, lover boy, because you're never going to touch me ever again. She turned to the men, smirking. Come here, boys, and show little Mark how a real man treats a woman. The men, except Jerry, surrounded her, stripping off their clothes. Mark, enraged, shook his head and tried to scream no through the gag. Jerry stood by Mark's chair, his arms crossed, clearly there to keep Mark in line. Lisa led the men to the bed, sitting down with a victorious grin. This will teach you to cheat on me, you jerk, she snarled. She laid back as 2 of the men stood beside her. Jack looked at Mark, chuckling. Nothing personal, Mark, but Lisa's the best I've ever had, he laughed. Turning back to Lisa, he asked, Ready, baby? Yeah, Jack, take me again and make my husband watch, she purred. Mark was sick to his stomach. The degradation continued, but he could barely hear the lewd comments anymore, his mind consumed by fury. Lisa was right about one thing. He would never touch her again. The rage inside him kept growing. His breathing techniques, honed through years of martial arts training, were failing him now. He could feel his pulse thumping in his temples. As Mark watched, his vision blurred with fury. He barely registered that Lisa had knelt up on the bed again, laughing. "Don't worry, honey," she said sarcastically. "We're just getting warmed up, aren't we, boys?" The men laughed in agreement. Mark looked up at Jerry, who was smiling as he watched the show. Jerry turned to Mark and frowned. He grabbed Mark's head, forcing him to look at the stage. "Watch them, not me," Jerry growled. The room's dark energy and the twisted scene unfolding sent Mark's mind spiraling further into the darkness. Lisa sneered again. "You want to see how nasty I can be?" she teased. "I'll probably get pregnant tonight." She laughed at Mark's helplessness. "None of them used protection, and I've been off the pill for weeks. Don't worry, though. I used a diaphragm when you had your Aussie kiss with me, so you don't have to worry about it being yours. But you will raise this child as your own, and if you refuse, I'll divorce you and ruin you." Her smile was pure malice. "I'll take everything from you. I'll make you a pariah and label you a domestic abuser and a cuck." Mark's face flushed with heat as his rage swelled beyond control. His fists clenched tight, the zip ties cutting into his skin. Lisa continued, her voice dripping with cruelty. "You're probably wondering why Jerry hasn't done me yet, aren't you?" she asked. "Well, Jerry prefers men over women, and after tonight, you will too." The men laughed again. Jerry stood beside Mark, his zipper undone, smirking. "I promise you'll love it," Jerry whispered. That was it. Mark's mind snapped. The next thing he knew, he was standing amidst a pile of moaning bodies. Jerry was screaming in agony, his left hand pinned to the table by the knife Mark had plunged into it. Blood dripped from Mark's wrists and ankles where the zip ties had cut deep into his skin. His entire body ached from the burst of adrenaline-fueled strength that had set him free. Lisa stood across the room, wide-eyed and trembling. "Please, don't hurt me," she whimpered. Mark stared at her coldly. "Oh, now you're scared of me? Don't worry, I won't hurt you, but I promise you'll feel my wrath in a way you can't imagine. You will regret this night for the rest of your life." Keeping his eyes on her, Mark pulled his phone out of his pocket, his hands shaking with adrenaline, and dialed 911. When he finished the call, he looked back at Lisa, who had fallen to her knees, sobbing. "You ignorant woman," he growled, his voice low but filled with fury. "I've got you dead to rights. You thought I was cheating on you with that blonde? That was my sister, you idiot! My sister! Did you even bother to read the report that came with that photo you threw in my face?" Lisa shook her head, trembling. "No, I just saw the picture." "That's right, you jumped to conclusions like you always do." Mark's voice was a cold whisper now. "Well, guess what? You're right about one thing. I'm never touching you again. I'll see you in jail, and then I'll divorce you. You've pulled the final straw. We're finished." "No, Mark, please don't do that," Lisa cried, crawling toward him. "Trust me, Lisa. For your own safety, stay away from me. I don't want to even think about what I'd do to you right now." Mark could see Lisa's terror, but his anger was too deep to care. "I made a mistake, that's all," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, we can fix this." "You made a colossal mistake," Mark snarled. "You played your part, and now I'll make sure you pay for it." By then, the police had arrived. Several officers broke down the front door and stormed into the basement with guns drawn. They quickly moved through the room, checking on the men writhing in pain. One officer pulled the knife out of Jerry's hand, and Jerry slumped to the floor. A sergeant approached Mark. "Did you do all this?" he asked, surveying the scene. Mark nodded, still standing over the chaos he had created. "Why?" the sergeant asked. Mark gestured toward the camera that had been recording everything. "Check the video, and you'll know why." The sergeant motioned to another officer, who looked at the footage briefly before calling the sergeant over. After a quick scan of the video, the sergeant returned to Mark. "Looks like self-defense on your part, but I'll need a full statement. You also need to get checked out. You're bleeding." By now, ambulances had arrived, and paramedics began taking the injured men upstairs on gurneys. A plainclothes detective entered the room, looking around before approaching the sergeant and Mark. "I'm Detective Johnson," he said, extending a hand. "You must be Mr. Stevens." Mark nodded, still trembling from the adrenaline surge. "I've looked at the video," Johnson continued. "It seems like self-defense. Tell me what happened." Mark recounted the horrific events, his voice shaky as the adrenaline left his body. The detective took notes, listening carefully. "How did you manage to break out of that chair?" Johnson asked. "And how did you take down all these men? They're a lot bigger than you." Mark hesitated. "I have a medical condition I've had since I was a kid. My adrenaline levels can spike under certain conditions, and I basically lose control. I've got medication to keep it under control, and my martial arts training helps me stay calm. But this was different." "Do you have that medication with you?" Johnson asked. Mark nodded. "I keep it with me at all times, only take it when I need it." Johnson asked for water, which another officer quickly brought. "You might want to take a pill now," Johnson said, handing Mark the bottle. Mark took out a small packet, swallowed a pill with the water, and began to feel better as his heart rate slowed down. "You feeling okay now?" Johnson asked. Mark nodded, calming down. "Do you remember what you did?" Johnson asked again. "No," Mark admitted, shaking his head. Johnson showed Mark the footage on the camera. It was like watching a movie, a brutal and chaotic blur of violence. In the video, Mark ripped through the zip ties, grabbed Jerry's knife, and plunged it into his hand, taking down the other men in less than a minute. Mark's face paled as he watched. "I don't remember any of this," he whispered. "I didn't even think I had it in me." "What's the last thing you remember?" Johnson asked. "That man was about to force me." Mark stopped, his voice breaking. Johnson nodded, understanding. "So, he was going to assault you and your wife was in on it?" Mark nodded, still in shock. "I see," Johnson said. He glanced across the room, where another officer was taking Lisa's statement. She was wrapped in a blanket, sobbing. "I want you to get checked out at the hospital, Mr. Stevens. We'll talk more after we've gathered all the evidence," Johnson said, his tone softening. "I take it you'll want to press charges?" "Absolutely," Mark replied, his voice firm, "and especially against her. She's the one who started all of this." "Very well," Johnson said. He took Mark's contact information as paramedics checked out his wrists and ankles. "They'll be in touch, Mr. Stevens," Johnson added. "And I'd appreciate it if you didn't leave town for a while." "I'm not going anywhere," Mark replied. Detective Johnson nodded, then gave instructions to the officers before heading over to where Lisa was still being questioned. A few minutes later, Mark heard her wail as she was handcuffed and led out of the room. "Please, Mark," she cried. "Don't let them take me away. Please. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding." Mark shook his head, looking the other way, unwilling to even acknowledge her pleas. He felt numb inside. Once the police finished questioning everyone and securing the scene, Mark drove to the hospital to get checked out. He was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. After the paramedics treated his cuts and bruises, he was finally able to head home, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. On the way home, he realized he hadn't eaten since leaving Salt Lake City. He stopped at a drive-thru, grabbing a burger, but barely tasted it as he ate. The food was just fuel to keep him going. Once home, he collapsed onto the couch, not knowing how to process everything that had just happened. His life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. After a fitful night of sleep, Mark woke up the next morning, still reeling from the events of the previous day. He decided to cancel the order for the sapphire necklace he had planned to give Lisa for their anniversary. He called the jewelry store, paid a small restocking fee, and got most of his money back. Then, he canceled the hotel reservation for the weekend trip he had arranged, reversing the charges on his credit card. Next on his list was finding a divorce attorney. Mark had no doubt that his marriage to Lisa was over. He wasn't sure what legal steps he needed to take, but he knew he had to act fast. After a few phone calls, he scheduled a meeting with Emily Parker, a well-known local divorce attorney, for later that week. That afternoon, Mark received a call from Lisa's parents. His mother-in-law, Marge, was furious. "Mark, what the hell is going on?" she demanded as soon as he answered. "Lisa called from the county jail. She said she's been arrested, and they're holding her without bail. What did you do?" Mark couldn't believe her nerve. He counted to 10, took a few deep breaths, and calmly responded. Did she tell you why she was arrested? She said it was some kind of misunderstanding, Marge replied. On my part? Really? Did she mention that she plotted to have me tied up and forced to watch her with multiple men, or that one of her male friends was planning to assault me? What? Why would she do something like that? Marge asked, clearly shocked. Because she saw a picture of me having dinner with my younger sister and thought I was cheating on her. Lisa's crazy. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a lawyer to file for divorce. You can't be serious. I understand you're upset, but surely you can see how Lisa might feel. What would you do if you saw a picture of her having lunch with a man? I'd ask her about it. I wouldn't jump to conclusions like she did. Look, Marge, you have no idea what your daughter has done, and I can't overlook it. I've been dealing with her jealousy for years, but this time, she went way too far. It's over. Marge fell silent, and after a few moments she quietly asked, What if the roles were reversed, Mark? If you had done this to her, would you expect her to stay married to you? Mark's voice was cold. No, and you wouldn't either. Don't be a hypocrite, Marge. You know what I'm doing is the right thing. Without waiting for a response, he ended the call. When she tried calling back, he sent it straight to voicemail. He couldn't deal with her anymore. Feeling drained, Mark decided to go into the spare bedroom where he and Lisa had set up their home computers. He sat down at Lisa's computer, already knowing her password, and logged in. He wanted to see if there was anything in her emails that might help him understand what she had been thinking. What he found was far worse than he could have imagined. An email from Rogers Investigations was sitting in her inbox. Mark opened it, and inside was a detailed report from the private investigator Lisa had hired. Attached was the same photo she had thrown at him the night before. The report clearly stated that the woman in the photo was Sophia Stevens, Mark's younger sister, and that there was no evidence of Mark engaging in any inappropriate behavior. It was a simple dinner with family. Lisa had seen the photo and jumped to conclusions without bothering to read the report. Mark printed the report and kept digging through her emails. What he found next shocked him even more. Messages exchanged between Lisa and Jerry. In them, Lisa falsely claimed that Mark was cheating on her, and Jerry provided detailed instructions on how to get revenge. He even suggested a website where they could upload videos of what they did to Mark, and Lisa seemed all too eager to follow his lead. Mark's blood boiled as he read the email chain. It was clear that the events of the previous night had been carefully planned, and the goal had been to humiliate and assault him, all while recording it for their twisted website. He printed everything, including the emails, the investigator's report, and the details about the revenge plot. Feeling sick to his stomach, Mark checked Lisa's browser history and found that she had visited several websites similar to the one Jerry had recommended. These were places where men were tied down, forced to watch their wives engage in group activities, and then degraded in front of the camera. The final humiliation for many of the men involved Jerry himself, who seemed to enjoy taking things to the extreme. Mark couldn't believe it. He recognized the names of some of the men from the emails and now understood that Lisa and her so-called friends were regular participants in this disgusting game. He wondered how many men had fallen victim to these same twisted schemes. Not willing to wait, Mark picked up his phone and called Detective Johnson. Johnson, the detective answered. Detective, this is Mark Stevens. I found some information you might be interested in, Mark said. Can you come over to my house? Sure, Johnson replied. Let me finish up here and I'll be right over. Half an hour later, Johnson arrived. Mark led him to the computer room and showed him the printouts he had gathered. Johnson looked through the emails, his face hardening as he read. This backs up what we've found so far, Johnson said. It looks like these guys have been doing this to other men for quite some time. We found evidence suggesting that at least 15 men have been victimized in the last 18 months. Mark felt a wave of anger rise inside him. What about the release forms, he asked. Were the husbands forced to sign anything? We found release forms signed by the wives, but nothing from the husbands. It looks like your wife signed a form for this as well. So she knew this would be posted online, Mark asked, incredulous. Looks that way, Johnson confirmed. We're still going through all the evidence, though. Mark shook his head in disbelief. Can you take her computer as evidence? Of course, Johnson said, but I'll let you keep the printouts for your attorney. Just don't destroy the digital files. After Johnson left with Lisa's computer, Mark sat down at his own machine and began searching for more information. He wanted to know who owned the website Jerry had mentioned in the emails. Although the registration was private, Mark knew law enforcement could subpoena the records. He printed the information he found and waited for Johnson to dig deeper into the case. The next day, Mark met with Emily Parker, his divorce attorney. He handed her all the documents he had printed, and Emily listened carefully as he explained the situation. After reading the emails, Emily shook her head. I've seen some nasty divorces, but this one takes the cake, she said. Fortunately, this state allows divorce on the grounds of adultery, cruelty, and abuse. I think we've got all three here. You say your wife is being held without bail? Yes, Mark replied. Emily turned to her computer. After a few moments, she nodded. I see that she was arraigned yesterday and hit with multiple charges, including spousal abuse, sexual assault, conspiracy to commit assault, fraud, and illegal imprisonment. The judge deemed her a danger to others, so she's being kept in custody. It also looks like her accomplices are facing similar charges. Mark nodded in agreement, grateful that the system was finally catching up with the people who had wronged him. What about the men who run that website? Mark asked. They're profiting from this. We'll definitely go after them, Emily said. But first, we'll focus on the divorce. I'll file papers asking for 90% of the assets. We'll start high and use her criminal charges as leverage. If the judge releases her at any point, I'll get a restraining order against her and her accomplices, but I don't think she'll be out anytime soon. Mark nodded. And what about the video? Detective Johnson has it, but it never made it to the internet. I'll coordinate with him to make sure it's used as evidence, Emily replied. As for the website, we'll file a civil claim against the owners and the hosting provider. They've made money off your humiliation, and that needs to stop. Before Mark left her office, Emily gave him a piece of advice. Stay away from your wife. Don't think about what she did. Let me and the authorities handle it. And if you need help dealing with all this, I can refer you to a therapist. Mark nodded. I think that would help. I've tried managing this with breathing exercises, but it's not enough. Emily smiled and handed him a card. I'll make the call right now. A few moments later, she arranged an appointment with Dr. Kelly, a therapist who specialized in trauma. She can see you this afternoon at 4. Does that work for you? Mark nodded. That'll be fine, thanks. He left Emily's office, feeling somewhat relieved. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but at least he was starting to take control of his life again. After taking care of some banking matters, closing out joint accounts, and opening a new one in his name, he drove to Lisa's parents' house. There, he explained everything, showing them the emails and the private investigator's report. Marge was horrified. This is sick. I can't believe she would do something like this. Are you sure you didn't cheat on her? Mark sighed. Marge, I never cheated on her. That photo she saw was of me having dinner with my sister. She didn't even bother to read the report. If she had, none of this would have happened. I don't know what to say, Marge replied, shaking her head. I'm so sorry, Mark. Mark handed her Lisa's car keys. Her car is still at that guy's place. You can go pick it up. I'll bring her things by this weekend. Thank you, Marge said quietly, clearly ashamed of what her daughter had done. Mark then headed to his appointment with Dr. Kelly. The therapist listened carefully as Mark recounted his story, offering him a safe space to vent his frustrations. I've heard of your condition, she said thoughtfully. And you say martial arts training has helped you control it? Yes, Mark replied, breathing exercises mostly, along with medication. Normally I don't have to use the medication much, but this situation was different. Maybe we should explore some meditation techniques as well, Dr. Kelly suggested. Would you be open to that? I would, Mark agreed. Dr. Kelly assured him that, with time and work, he could get through this without relying solely on medication. After the session, Mark went home, packed up Lisa's belongings, including her wedding dress and any other mementos that reminded him of her. He wanted no trace of her left in his house. That weekend, he changed the locks, dropped off her things at her parents' house, and focused on his usual weekend routine of yard work. The next few weeks were a blur. Mark threw himself into his work, found solace in his therapy sessions with Dr. Kelly, and followed the advice Emily had given him. He kept his distance from Lisa and focused on rebuilding his life. Things felt quieter without her, and for the first time in years, Mark felt like he could breathe freely. Months passed, and as Lisa's trial approached, Mark was asked to testify. He was more than willing. The district attorney presented all the evidence, including Mark's testimony and the video footage from that horrific night. The jury was so shocked by what they saw that they returned a guilty verdict on all charges within a couple of hours. The judge had no sympathy for Lisa, sentencing her to the maximum of 20 years in prison, with eligibility for parole in 15. As the judge pronounced the sentence, a server stepped forward, handed Lisa a manila envelope, and said, "You've been served." Defeated, Lisa signed the divorce papers and handed them back. She glanced at Mark, her eyes filled with tears, but he simply looked away. The deputies led her out of the courtroom, and Mark felt the weight lift from his shoulders as she was taken to the state women's prison. The trials for Jack and his crew took longer. Detective Johnson uncovered a trove of evidence that implicated them in the victimization of at least 15 men over the last 18 months. The release forms signed by the wives did little to protect them, especially since the men had signed them under duress. Some victims had been driven to suicide by the humiliation they suffered, and the court did not go easy on the perpetrators. Jack, Tommy, Jerry, and the others were sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. The website was taken down, and the victims, or at least those Emily's team could locate, received a substantial settlement that bankrupted Jack and his associates. Even the hosting provider agreed to a settlement. One day, Emily handed Mark a check for $2 million. "This is restitution," she said, "but I know it doesn't make up for what you've been through." Mark was grateful for the financial compensation, but it did little to heal the emotional wounds. Emily tried to comfort him, saying, "You're a good man, Mark Stevens. There are plenty of good women out there who would love to be with you. You'll find her." Mark smiled weakly, maybe one day. Mark continued his therapy sessions with Dr. Kelly, and over the next 2 years, he slowly began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his work, went on a few dates here and there, but it wasn't until recently that he started seeing someone more consistently. Dr. Kelly noted in her files, "He's got a lot of issues to work through, but he hasn't had any more episodes. I think he'll be just fine in the long run. At least I hope so." A few days after his therapy session, Mark met a man in a local bar. Their conversation lasted no more than 10 minutes. Afterward, Mark walked out to his car, placed a small briefcase on the ground, and waited. A few moments later, the man picked up the briefcase, nodded at Mark, and walked away. 5 days later, Emily called Mark with some news. Lisa had gotten pregnant from the events of that fateful night, but had suffered a miscarriage after being attacked by 3 large women in the prison bathroom. She was bleeding heavily and had been rushed to the hospital. According to the doctors, she would never be able to conceive again. Mark's only thought was, people like her should never breed. A week later, Mark learned that Jack and Tommy had been killed in a massive prison riot during lunch. Steve was found hanging in his cell just 2 days later. Jake was shot and killed while trying to climb the prison wall with 2 other inmates. The others were unharmed. Bull and 2 other men died under mysterious circumstances, with autopsies revealing they had been poisoned. Jerry, however, was the luckiest, or so he thought. He managed to escape prison with 2 other inmates and cross the border into Mexico. But what he didn't know was that his freedom was a trap. His accomplices delivered him to Tijuana, where he thought he could hide. One night, while dining at a local restaurant, Jerry met a beautiful woman who invited him to dance. They spent the night together, and she offered to take him to her home. Grinning ear to ear, Jerry eagerly accepted. When they arrived at her place, Jerry was knocked unconscious as soon as they entered the bedroom. When Jerry came to, he was tied to a chair in a dark room. A man approached him, holding a phone in front of his face. The screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar voice. Hello, Jerry, remember me? Mark's face filled the screen. His tone was icy as he continued. I hope my friends treated you well. I asked them to be gentle and to stretch the night out as long as possible. Just like you told me once. I promise you'll love it. Jerry tried to scream, but his mouth was gagged. In the corner of the room, he heard the roar of a chainsaw coming to life. A man dressed in a yellow raincoat and a gas mask stepped forward, the chainsaw gleaming in the dim light. The man leaned closer to Jerry, his voice muffled through the mask. Do you like stew? What do you think of the way things turned out? Could it have ended differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Thanks for hanging out with me on today's episode. Brother, I'm Jack, host of this podcast, and it's great having you here. If today's story hit home, send it on to a buddy who might need it. Remember, we're all in this together, turning life's curvy balls into wins. If you have an opinion or story to share, then drop a line in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out. Until next time, keep your chin up and keep pushing forward. Stay strong, folks.